Thank you for that introduction, Shannon. Okay, so I want to talk to you about why Alberta should become independent. In order to understand why Alberta should become independent, it's really important to understand our history, because Westerners have felt neglected and even exploited by Canada over many years, and so the sentiment has been building over a period of years and getting getting stronger. So as the feeling of exploitation and neglect builds and builds, more and more Albertans begin to understand why we need to become independent. The US Declaration of Independence uses the phrase, a long train of abuses, to explain why the American colonies had to become independent from Britain. And I would suggest that Alberta has also experienced a long train of abuses from central Canada, and that helps to explain why we should become independent. The West has long felt unfairly treated within Canada. This part of the Prairie West used to be part of what was called Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and Canada purchased Rupert's Land and annexed it to Canada. There were already people living here at that time. There were thousands of people in the Red River Colony in what is now Manitoba, and they were not consulted about becoming part of Canada. They were just annexed to Canada without being consulted, and some of them had different ideas about what they thought would be best for their political future. So there's been Western discontent right from the very beginning of the West being part of Canada. Then after this became part of Canada, of course, settlers were brought in to create an agricultural economy. And that was good, of course. We have lots of farmers. But the farmers were at certain disadvantages. For one, there was a protective tariff so that the farmers had to purchase their farming equipment from central Canada at higher prices. And when they sold their grain, they had to sell their grain through middlemen, so they lost part of the price to the middlemen, and they also had to pay the transportation costs. So when they bought their equipment, they had to pay more, and when they sold their grain, they got less than they ought to have. And so they were at a disadvantage right from the very beginning. Now, of course, they didn't just sit back and take that. They fought back. And one of the ways Albertans fought back in those days was by turning away from the mainstream parties and creating new parties. So in the 1920s, Alberta had a government by a party called the United Farmers of Alberta. It was the provincial government for the 1920s into the 1930s. And at that time, in the 1920s, the main federal party in Alberta was the Progressive Party. And in those days, the word progressive meant something different than it does today. So Alberta had different parties to represent, Albertans had different parties to represent them than the mainstream parties. And this was a way of fighting back against what they felt was injustice toward Alberta, and they were right about that. Now, Albertans at that point yet hadn't developed the sense that they should become independent. They just fought back using these different alternative parties. Now, one of the most different alternative parties, or the one that was most distinct, was the Social Credit Party. Alberta elected a Social Credit Party government in 1935, and it was very unique in the world. It was the only time back in those days when Social Credit formed a government. So it was international news when Alberta elected a Social Credit government in 1935. And Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report magazine, he wrote this about that election, the election of the Social Credit government. He said, "While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation." So already back in those days, Albertans were fighting back, but they, like as I said, they didn't reach the point yet of thinking that Alberta should become an independent country. Now, the threshold was crossed, though, when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. When Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in the late 1960s, that's when Albertans really began to think about becoming an independent country, at least some of them. Pierre Trudeau, one of the main reasons he got involved in politics was he wanted to make Quebec feel more comfortable within Canada. And so one of the first policies he brought in was the Official Languages Act, which was to give French a stronger presence throughout the whole country, including in the West. But French wasn't, of course, used very much here, and so many Westerners felt that French was being forced down their throats. So the first book written about Western independence came out in 1971. It was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays. Now, what's really significant about this is there was two editors who put these essays together, John Barr and Owen Anderson. And John Barr was the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education at that time. And Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta Premier Harry Strom, the last Social Credit Premier of Alberta. So these are influential people in the government. Now, most of the essays in this book were not favorable towards independence. They mostly favored decentralizing Canada. But there was the one by John Barr did talk about the possibility of Alberta independence. His argument basically was this: we need to try and improve Canada to make it better for Alberta, and if we can't improve Canada that way, then we should look at independence. So this is the first time really in print where we have this argument that let's first try and improve Canada, and then if we can't improve Canada, then we'll become independent. So that was written over 50 years ago. So that idea has been around for that long. Just give Canada another chance before trying to get out. So that's what they were talking about already 50 years ago. Now the real impetus though for the Alberta separatist movement began with events in 1973. There was a Middle East war in 1973 and the price of oil skyrocketed. So here was a chance for Alberta to really cash in on our oil resources. We've been selling oil all these years, but the price of oil had been low. Now it was extremely high and Alberta would be able to reap the benefits of its resources. But Pierre Trudeau did two things to make sure that Central Canada would benefit more than they ought to have, and Alberta wouldn't benefit it very much as they could have. First of all, the price of Western Canadian oil was kept low within Canada, so the Alberta oil sold within Canada was kept much lower than the world price, so Alberta wouldn't get as much money as they ought to have. Also, Alberta sold oil to the United States, exported oil to the United States, and Pierre Trudeau instituted an export tax on oil, so that Alberta's oil exported to the United States, that much of that money would actually go to the federal government rather than Alberta, which, even though the resources belong to Alberta. So whether the oil was sold within Canada or exported, Alberta was not getting the full benefit of its resources. Of course, this made many Albertans angry, and Premier Peter Lougheed at the time fought very hard against Pierre Trudeau throughout the 1970s to improve the situation so that Alberta could benefit more from its oil resources. There was a federal election in 1979, and Joe Clark was elected. He was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and he was from Alberta. It was a minority government, but it was felt that since Joe Clark was from Alberta, that Alberta would finally get a better deal from the federal government. But because it was a minority government, it fell after only a few months, and there was a new federal election campaign in 1980. Now this 1980 election campaign is very significant. It's the one that brought Pierre Trudeau back. There was one of the prominent Liberal campaign officials at the time was a guy named Keith Davey, and he summarized the Liberal campaign program as this: screw the West, we'll take the rest. Like historically in Canada, like any big country, like there's different regional interests and there's competition between the regional interests. Normally you expect national leaders to try and smooth over the regional differences in the interest of national unity, to promote national unity. But in this particular federal campaign, instead of emphasizing national unity, Pierre Trudeau decided to exploit the regional differences and campaign against Alberta. He basically told Central Canada that Alberta is the bad guy and they can re-elect him and he'll put Alberta in its place. So it was a very divisive kind of national election campaign, a kind that we hadn't had before. So of course Albertans were unhappy when Pierre Trudeau was re-elected in 1980. And then shortly after that, he brought in the National Energy Program, which was basically for the federal government to take over much more control of Alberta's oil industry so that the Central Canada would benefit even more than it had already. But basically it was a federal government taking control of Alberta's oil industry. Of course, Albertans were very angry, and this is when many people began to contemplate separatism when they never had before. Now, it's very interesting and very significant about 1980, something that Pierre Trudeau did. Well, this National Energy Program and his policies toward Alberta in general turned Albertans against the federal government and made them think about separatism in a way that they never had before. There was a change in Alberta's political culture in 1980. Before 1980, when polling was done on support for independence or separatism, the polling support was generally single-digit support, like 4 or 5 or 6%. After 1980, it's always been double-digit support for independence, sometimes as low as 15 or 16%, but usually more 20 or 25% or higher. So there's a permanent change in Alberta's political culture in 1980 as a result of what Pierre Trudeau did. And so I consider Pierre Trudeau to be the father of the Alberta independence movement because he's the one who created it. Speaking of that, Justin Trudeau likes to talk about a fringe minority. Well, people in Alberta who support Pierre Trudeau, that is a real fringe minority. Anyway, with the rise in separatist support, there was a by-election in 1982 in the Olds Didsbury constituency, and a party called the Western Canada Concept Party elected its candidate. It was the first time a Western separatist had ever been elected in Canada, and so it signified how significant and how deep sentiment in Alberta was for independence at that time. And even though there was that deep, significant sentiment, there were still many people who thought it would be better to reform Canada. And one of these people was Senator Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning had been premier from 1943 to 1968, Alberta's longest premier. After he resigned as premier, he was appointed to the Senate. And he and 3 prominent colleagues in 1981 wrote a book called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. And the argument of their book, again, they were noting how Alberta was alienated from the rest of Canada, and they said there needed to be changes in Canada's national institutions in order to incorporate Alberta's views, in order to give the West a stronger voice within the national institutions. They proposed like a Senate reform so that Western interests could be represented in the national government. And they said that if these reforms of the national institutions were not done, then support for separatism in the West would get stronger and be more likely that the West would separate. But again, it's the idea that we need to reform Canada rather than, in order to prevent separatism from happening. And that was 1981. In 1984, Pierre Trudeau resigned. He was replaced by John Turner. Then there was an election later that year, and Brian Mulroney, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, was elected. And so we got rid of the Liberal government, and many Albertans felt, well, okay, we got rid of the Liberals and Trudeau, now things are going to be okay for us. Every member of Parliament from Alberta was part of Mulroney's government, so now we'll be treated fairly. But as it turned out, it didn't really turn out that way. It didn't turn out the way many Westerners felt. In 1986, the federal government had to award a maintenance contract for Canada's new CF-18 fighter jets. The fighter jets had to be maintained by a company that would specialize in that. And there were two cities that were in competition for getting that maintenance contract: Winnipeg and Montreal. There were companies in each of those cities that could do this work. So the federal government had a specific criteria to determine which of the companies would be best. And based on the federal government's own criteria, the company in Winnipeg would be the best one suited for maintaining the CF-18 contract. So Brian Mulroney awarded the contract to the company in Montreal. Because the Conservative Party, just like the Liberal Party, always faces the same situation, that if they want to get elected, they have to cater to Central Canada. They have to get the votes of Central Canada. So whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives, they always face the pressure of catering to Central Canada. Of course, the Conservative Party has been better to Alberta historically, and a Conservative government in Ottawa is better than a Liberal government. There's no question about that. But they can't solve Alberta's fundamental problems with federal government. A Conservative Party government is basically a band-aid solution. It's a temporary solution. Even if someone like Pierre Poilievre became Prime Minister, he would be better for us for a few years, but then he would be gone and be replaced by a Liberal. So the best they can offer us is a temporary reprieve. They can't solve our problem. So that's why I say the Conservative Party of Canada is only a band-aid solution to the problems that we have. Now, because of what happened with the CF-18 contract, a new federal political party was formed, the Reform Party of Canada. Many of you would probably remember that. And their slogan was "The West wants in." They thought that, that the national government could be reformed so that Western voices could be heard in the national government. And I have here a photocopy of a pamphlet from 1987, "A New Federal Political Party to Represent the West." This pamphlet is from the Reform Association of Canada, the precursor organization to the Reform Party. This became the Reform Party. But let me just read a couple of sentences from this pamphlet to get a sense of what they were dealing with in 1987, 35 years ago. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. That is, Ontario and Quebec continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic Hello? Is that better? Okay. Okay, I'll start with the second quote here. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change. This is 35 years ago, 1987, and is anything different today after all this time? That's right, nothing really has changed. Now, in the year after this came out, in 1988, there was a progressive conservative MP from Edmonton named David Kilgour. He was a good man. He understood Western alienation. And he wrote a book called Uneasy Patriots, Western Canadians and Confederation, to explain the roots of Western dissatisfaction and how Canada needs to be changed. And this is what he concluded. He said, "The time has come to address a long-standing injustice and bring the West into equal partnership with all other regions of the country." That is, he said, the time had come to address the long-standing injustice, and that was 1988. And it looked like the time had come then because the Reform Party was rising, and many people were beginning to support the Reform Party. And of course, the Reform Party did get much support from Alberta. Most of Alberta's MPs were Reform Party MPs in the 1993 and 1997 election because we supported them so strongly and we wanted these reforms to take place. One of the major policies of the Reform Party was to get a Triple E Senate, which would be an elected Senate with effective powers and equal representation from each of the provinces. So something like that would have given Alberta some power within the national institutions so that our interests could be represented in there. Now, in spite of all the support for the Reform Party gradually lost interest in these Western issues. It saw more and more an emphasis on taking national power, so it converted itself into the Canadian Alliance. And then in 2003, it joined with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the Conservative Party of Canada. And the first leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and the first Conservative Party Prime Minister was Stephen Harper. And many Westerners trusted Stephen Harper because he had been one of the founders of the Reform Party and he was from Calgary. So we knew that he would not be acting against Western Canadian interests. So at that time, there was very little support for Western independence during the Stephen Harper years because we trusted him and we looked up to him. Of course, that all changed in 2015 because Justin Trudeau was elected as the new Liberal Prime Minister. And Justin Trudeau came in with a very different agenda, one that was very harmful to Alberta and to the West. One of the bills that Justin Trudeau's government brought in was Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which makes it so much harder to get pipelines approved within Canada. In fact, many people call that the No More Pipelines Bill, because essentially it'll make it impossible for more pipelines to be built in Canada. You may have heard about 3 weeks ago or something, the Alberta Court of Appeal ruled that the Impact Assessment Act is unconstitutional, but that's just it's just an advisory opinion. It doesn't have any effect, and this issue is going to be decided at the Supreme Court of Canada, and it's more likely that the Supreme Court will actually uphold this law than strike it down. We can't know that for sure now, but it's very likely that the Supreme Court will uphold it. Another bill that Justin Trudeau's government brought in was Bill C-68, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which some people call the Alberta Tanker Ban because it essentially prohibits Alberta oil from being exported off of BC's coast. Now, as a result of these kinds of laws, Alberta is losing control of its natural resources. The Constitution guarantees that the provinces own and control their natural resources, but Justin Trudeau has brought in policies that circumvent the constitutional protections, and so Alberta is increasingly losing control of the natural resources. Of course, the Alberta government challenged Justin Trudeau's carbon tax in the court, and the Supreme Court upheld the carbon tax. It upheld Justin Trudeau's law. One of the dissenting judges, though, in that decision was from Alberta, and he wrote in criticism of the Supreme Court's decision, he said that this decision opens the door to federal intrusion into all areas of provincial jurisdiction. So it's opening the door to even more federal control in areas where the provinces should have their control. In essence, these policies of Justin Trudeau are circumventing the constitutional guarantee of provincial control of natural resources. Now, even as Justin Trudeau tries to shut down our oil industry, the federal government is still reaping billions of dollars from Alberta from the oil industry itself. So they're trying to shut it down and they're getting money from it at the same time. And there's a professor at the University of Calgary, Robert Manzel. He's followed these issues for many, many years, and he calculates that from 1965 to 2018, Alberta has made a net contribution of $630 billion to the federal government. But that's the bad news. Now, I do have good news. Now, the good news is Canada's constitutional law allows for provinces to peacefully separate from Canada. In 1995, you might remember, Quebec had an independence referendum which barely failed. And after that referendum, and as a result of that, the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court. And that's where they asked the Supreme Court its opinion, on Canada's constitutional law. And the question was, can Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? Can Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? And the Supreme Court ruled that no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. However, it did rule that if Quebec was to have a referendum with a clear question and a clear majority voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would have an obligation to negotiate Quebec's independence. Now, this is a case specifically with reference to Quebec, but the constitutional law applies to every province. So this means that for every province in Canada, if they hold a clear question, like if they have a referendum with a clear question on independence and a clear majority of people vote in favor of it, then that federal government has an obligation to negotiate that province's independence. That's kind of the core idea. There's, of course, many other details you can look into, but this is the core idea that you need to understand, that it is constitutional in Canada for a province to hold a referendum and to leave peacefully from Canada according to Canada's constitutional law. There are other countries in the world who have constitutions that without that kind of law. Like you might remember just a few years ago in Catalonia in Spain, that district of Spain voted to separate from Spain, but then the Spanish government arrested the leaders of that movement, and Catalonia was not allowed to separate. But that's because Spain's constitution prohibits any part of the country from separating. So their constitution prohibits it. Canada's constitutional law allows it. So just because something happens in one country doesn't mean that applies to Canada. Now, all of this historical information I brought for this particular purpose, and that is to argue that if we look at this history, we realize that Alberta must become independent. I talked about John Barr's article in 1971, already over 50 years ago, saying, first let's try and reform Canada, then if we can't reform, then let's become independent. And then in 1981, Ernest Manning and his colleagues said, if we don't reform Canada's national institutions, then it's very likely that the West is going to want to separate. Then in 1988, David Kilgour said, the time has come to rectify these injustices. And even more important was the Reform Party of Canada. We elected all those MPs and we sent them east to fix things, and they weren't able to get it fixed. And it's not any fault of theirs. It's because Canada cannot be fixed. And this is the message of the experience of the Reform Party. Canada's political system cannot be fixed in a way that's beneficial for Alberta. Now, it's important for us to realize we can learn from history, and we must learn from history. John Barr in 1971 could not know that Canada wasn't going to be able to be reformed. And Ernest Manning in 1981, he couldn't know that Canada could not be reformed. Same for David Kilgour in 1988 and for the Reform Party.
Batteries.
Yeah. The point is, these people were all doing good work, and from their historical vantage point, it made sense. What they did made sense back then, and now, 35 years later, we have all this experience that they did not have, and we can look back and see, okay, they tried, they did the best they could, and it didn't work. So ultimately, my point is this. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Triple E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it can't be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but it does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is for Alberta to get out. If we keep asking Central Canada for a better deal for Alberta, they will just keep laughing at us. They know there's nothing we can do, so they just keep laughing at us. But if we hold a referendum and we vote in favor of independence, they won't be laughing at us anymore. Like even Jason Kenney has tried to do a few things. Jason Kenney challenged the carbon tax at the Supreme Court, but of course the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Justin Trudeau's law. And Jason Kenney held the referendum on equalization. And where did that get us? Nothing. We've been trying and trying and trying, and none of these things work. And so Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of independence, or that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about, and become an independent country. Thank you.